There is a distinct moment in the life of every highly aware individual where everything suddenly stops working. The routines that used to sustain you now exhaust you. The goals you used to chase now feel entirely hollow. The relationships that once defined you now feel like obligations you can barely tolerate. You wake up in a life you spent a decade building, and a quiet, terrifying voice whispers that you don't recognize the person living it. Society will tell you that you are falling apart, that you are losing your edge, that you have burned out, that you have failed. But Carl Jung understood a much darker, much more liberating truth. You are not falling apart. The fake, compliant life you built to please others is finally collapsing, and it had to happen. The mask is falling, and underneath it, something far more dangerous is finally waking up. What you are feeling right now is not depression. It is not weakness. It is not the end. It is the precise psychological moment Carl Jung spent his entire life trying to describe, and it has been deliberately hidden from you because the system you serve depends on you never discovering it. You were trained from childhood to construct a self that is useful to others. A self that smiles when it should be silent. A self that says yes when every cell in its body is screaming no. A self that achieves, performs, accommodates, and apologizes for taking up space. That self is not you. That self is a costume. And costumes are not built to last a lifetime. The exhaustion you feel is not the failure of your willpower. It is the costume tearing at the seams because the being underneath has finally grown too large to wear it. Deep psychology has a name for this moment, and once you understand it, you will never see your current collapse the same way again. This is the architectural clearing. This is the burn that precedes the rebuild. This is the death that precedes the sovereign self. And if you stay with me through this, you will understand exactly why everything you built had to fall, what is actually being born inside that emptiness, and how to walk through the desert that lies between the person you were and the person you are becoming. If these ideas resonate with you, hit that subscribe button for more top-tier content. Also, drop a "The Mask Falls" in the comments so I know you're ready. Let's dive in. Carl Jung gave a name to the costume you have been wearing. He called it the persona. The word itself comes from the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre, and Jung chose it precisely because he understood that the self most people present to the world is not a self at all. It is a performance. It is the carefully engineered character you constructed to survive your family, succeed in your career, fit into your social circle, and earn the approval of people whose opinions you secretly stopped respecting years ago. Your persona is the version of you that knows exactly what to say at the dinner table, the version that laughs at jokes that are not funny, the version that takes on extra work without complaint, the version that absorbs other people's emotional waste and calls it being a good person. And here is the part that nobody told you. Your persona was never designed for your happiness. It was designed for your usefulness. Every accommodating gesture, every overextended yes, every suppressed opinion, every moment of swallowing your truth to keep the peace was a small contribution to a structure that was never built to house your soul. It was built to house your function. Shadow work begins the moment you realize this. The moment you understand that the life you achieved was not the life you wanted, but the life your persona was rewarded for pursuing. The promotion that drained you, the relationship that flattered your social image but starved your inner world, the friendships that demanded your loyalty but never returned your depth. None of that was chosen by you. It was chosen by the mask, and the mask is dying. That is what the exhaustion is. That is what the hollow feeling is. That is what the strange, quiet grief in the middle of your supposed success actually means. You are not losing your edge, you are losing your costume. And the being underneath, the one Carl Jung called the authentic self, is finally ready to take the stage. Jung observed something so unsettling about the human psyche that most people, even those who study him, refuse to sit with its full implications. He called it enantiodromia. The principle is brutally simple. Any force in the psyche, pushed to an extreme, will eventually convert into its exact opposite. The relentless optimist becomes the silent cynic. The tireless servant becomes the cold recluse. The endless people-pleaser becomes the person who can no longer stand the sound of another human voice. And the high achiever, who built their entire identity on output, performance, and visibility, wakes up one morning and discovers they want nothing more than to disappear. This is not a malfunction. This is a law. This is the psyche's self-correcting mechanism, announcing that the structure you have been maintaining is no longer sustainable. The version of you that smiled through every betrayal, accommodated every unreasonable demand, and performed strength while privately bleeding, was always going to reach this threshold. Carl Jung understood that the soul does not negotiate. When you suppress an entire dimension of yourself for long enough, that dimension does not vanish. It accumulates, it compounds. It builds pressure in the basement of your psyche until the foundation of your persona can no longer contain it. And then, in a moment that feels like collapse but is actually correction, the suppressed self breaks through. This is why the most accommodating people, the ones who gave the most, served the most, smiled the most, are the ones who eventually go silent, who stop returning calls, who walk away from careers, friendships, and entire identities without apology. The world calls this a breakdown. Deep psychology calls it enantiodromia. The pendulum, held too long on one side, finally swings. And the people who built their relationship with you on the assumption that you would always be the giver are about to meet a version of you they were never prepared for. The exhaustion you feel is the pendulum at its peak. The numbness is the pause before the swing. And on the other side of that swing is something the masses will never understand. A sovereign mind, a self that no longer asks permission to exist. A psychological center of gravity so strong that other people's expectations bend around it instead of bending you. There comes a moment in this transition where the old self has died, but the new self has not yet arrived. Jung called this liminal space by many names, but the one that captures it most precisely is the desert, the void, the terrifying middle distance, where you no longer want what you used to want, but you do not yet know what you actually want instead. This is the most dangerous stage of the entire Jungian rebirth, and it is the stage where most people retreat, because the void does not feel like growth. It feels like loss. It feels like nothing. It feels like you have somehow lost the operating system that used to run your life, and the new one has not finished installing. You sit in rooms you used to enjoy and feel nothing. You scroll through messages from people who used to matter and feel nothing. You look at the goals you used to chase, the career milestones you used to celebrate, the version of success you used to perform, and you feel a profound, almost spiritual indifference. This is the part where 95% of people panic. They mistake the silence for depression. They mistake the indifference for failure. They rush back into the old persona, frantically trying to revive the costume, taking on new projects, new commitments, new performances, anything to escape the unbearable openness of the void. And in doing so, they abort the rebirth. They crawl back into the cage just as the door was opening. But you are not most people. You are someone who has read this far, which means you already sense that the emptiness is not the enemy. The emptiness is the blank canvas. It is the architectural clearing Carl Jung wrote about with such precision. Before you can construct the sovereign self, the psyche must be emptied of the inherited identity. Before the new house can be built, the old structure must be fully demolished. The void is not the absence of life, it is the moment of maximum potential. It is the only psychological state in which true self-mastery becomes possible, because for the first time in your existence, you are not running on borrowed software. You are not performing a script written by your parents, your culture, your industry, or your past. You are sitting in the silence, with nothing to defend, nothing to maintain, nothing to perform. And in that silence, something begins to speak. Quietly at first, then unmistakably, your actual voice. The one that was buried beneath 3 decades of accommodation, the one that knows what it wants and is no longer willing to apologize for wanting it. To walk through the void without breaking, you must befriend a part of yourself that polite society has trained you to fear. Jung identified a series of archetypes that live within the unconscious mind, and the one that governs this stage of the rebirth is the destroyer. Now hear this carefully, because the destroyer is not what you have been conditioned to think it is. The destroyer is not cruelty. The destroyer is not malice. The destroyer is not the impulse to harm anything outside of you. The destroyer is the sacred psychological function that grants you permission to let dead things die. The job you have outgrown, the friendship that has decayed into obligation, the version of yourself that you have been performing long past its expiration date, the relationship that ended emotionally years before you found the courage to admit it. The destroyer is the inner authority that looks at all of these collapsing structures and says calmly and without apology, let it burn. Most people spend their entire lives terrified of this archetype because the persona is desperate to preserve itself. The persona will rationalize, negotiate, and beg. The persona will tell you that walking away makes you a bad person. The persona will flood you with guilt every time you consider prioritizing your own psychological survival over someone else's comfort. This is why shadow work is so essential at this stage. You must reclaim the parts of yourself that you were taught to suppress, the capacity for strategic detachment, the capacity for silence, the capacity to look at a life you spent a decade building and say, with full sovereignty, this is no longer mine to carry. Inner sovereignty is not built by adding more achievements to your existing structure. Inner sovereignty is built by subtraction, by the deliberate, conscious, almost ceremonial removal of everything that was never truly yours. The destroyer is not your enemy. The destroyer is the architect of the clearing. Without the destroyer, the new self cannot find ground to stand on. Without the destroyer, you will spend the rest of your life renovating a house that should have been demolished years ago. And the most liberating realization in all of deep psychology is this: letting something peacefully end is not a failure of love. It is the highest form of self-respect. Now we arrive at the reconstruction. Because the collapse is not the end of the story, the collapse is the precondition. Carl Jung used the word individuation to describe what happens on the other side of this process. Individuation is the lifelong work of becoming the specific, unrepeatable being you were always meant to be, free of inherited expectations, free of the persona's performance, free of the chronic need to be understood by people who were never equipped to understand you. The sovereign self is not louder than the persona, it is quieter. It does not announce itself, it simply stops auditioning. You will notice the shift in small, almost invisible ways at first. You will hear a request that would have automatically extracted a yes from your old self, and you will feel for the first time the calm, grounded sensation of saying no without explanation. You will sit in a room full of people performing the social games you used to participate in, and you will observe without engagement. You will notice the energy others spend, trying to be admired, validated, included, and you will feel a strange, almost philosophical detachment, because that game no longer has any pull on you. This is the mindset shift that changes everything. You stop being a participant in dynamics that drain you and become an observer of dynamics that no longer concern you. The people who knew the old persona will be deeply uncomfortable with this version of you. They will accuse you of having changed. They will be correct. They will call you cold, distant, different. They will be measuring you against a costume that no longer exists. And the most powerful thing you can do in those moments is exactly nothing. You do not explain. You do not defend. You do not perform a softened version of the old self to make them comfortable. You simply continue existing as the being you are becoming, and you allow the people who cannot meet you at this new altitude to organize themselves out of your life. Strategic detachment is not coldness, it is precision. It is the deliberate allocation of your attention to people, projects, and inner work that actually correspond to who you now are. Your psyche is a silent fortress, and from this point forward, you decide who is granted entry. This is the sovereign mind Carl Jung wrote about. This is the inner authority that the masses, still trapped in their own personas, will never recognize, because they are still measuring life by the standards of the costume. So how do you actually live from this place? How do you take the raw material of the collapse and convert it into a structure that does not betray you again? The first principle is this: you no longer build your life around what you should want. You build it around what you actually want, even when that desire makes no sense to the people who knew the old you. The persona was constructed by external metrics. The sovereign self is constructed by internal coherence. You will know you are operating from the new foundation when your decisions stop requiring justification, when you can decline an invitation, end a project, walk away from a conversation, or restructure your entire schedule without filing a mental report to an imaginary jury of observers. The second principle is the disciplined practice of silence. Not silence as suppression, but silence as self-mastery. The old persona could not tolerate a pause in the conversation. It rushed to fill every gap with reassurance, with apology, with explanation. The sovereign self has learned that silence is the most underused psychological resource in human interaction. When you stop explaining yourself, two things happen simultaneously. The people who require your explanation reveal themselves as people who require your compliance. And the people who can meet you in the silence reveal themselves as the only relationships worth investing in. The third principle is the conscious integration of the shadow. Every quality you spent decades suppressing in order to maintain the persona is now psychological material to be reclaimed. Your capacity for firmness, your capacity for solitude, your capacity for ambition that does not apologize, your capacity for anger as information rather than performance. These are not flaws to be managed. These are dimensions of your sovereignty that the old structure required you to amputate. Shadow work is the slow, patient process of reattaching them. The fourth principle is the strategic redirection of your energy. The betrayed intellectual spends years funneling psychological resources into people, systems, and self-images that produced no return. The sovereign mind audits every channel of energetic output and asks one question: does this correspond to who I now am? If the answer is no, the channel is calmly closed, not with drama, not with announcement, with the quiet finality of someone who has finally remembered that their attention is not infinite. This is how deep psychology becomes lived practice. This is how the philosophy of individuation becomes the daily architecture of a sovereign life. And this is how the collapse, the one that felt like the end of you, reveals itself to have been the beginning. You came into this video carrying a question you may have never said out loud. Why did I work so hard to achieve all these things, only to wake up one day and realize I don't want any of it? Now you have the answer. You did not fail. You outgrew. The life you built was a perfect fit for the persona you were performing, and that persona has completed its purpose. It got you here, to the threshold, to the collapse, to the moment of architectural clearing where the inherited self finally releases its grip and the sovereign self steps forward to take command. Everything you have been mourning was a costume. Everything you have been losing was a performance. Everything that has fallen away was never actually yours. And the exhaustion, the emptiness, the strange grief in the middle of your supposed success was never a sign of failure. It was the most accurate signal your psyche has ever sent you. It was telling you that the rebirth had begun. The masses will never understand this transition. They are still inside their personas, still performing, still measuring their lives by costumes that will eventually exhaust them as well. You are not them. You are someone undergoing a psychological evolution most people will spend their entire lives avoiding. So when the old life collapses around you, do not rush to rebuild it. Do not panic into a new performance. Do not crawl back into the cage just because the door is unfamiliar. Sit in the desert, befriend the destroyer, walk through the void with the steady patience of someone who finally understands that the silence is not punishment. The silence is the canvas. The collapse was the clearing, and what is being built in this stillness is not another costume. It is a sovereign self that no system, no relationship, no expectation will ever be able to shrink again. If this awakening lives in you, drop the words, "The mask falls," in the comments, not as agreement, as declaration, as the moment you publicly mark the end of the old self and the beginning of the sovereign mind. And if you are ready to keep walking this path, if you are ready to stop performing and start integrating, subscribe. This is the only place where the architecture of inner sovereignty, the deep psychology of Carl Jung, and the lived practice of self-mastery are explored without apology, without dilution, and without the polite filters that keep most people asleep. And whatever you do, don't stop now. The on-screen video matters more than you think. What I'm about to show you next is the precise psychological mechanism that determines whether the rebirth completes or collapses back into the old persona, and almost no one teaches it correctly. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. I'll see you there. See what others miss. Know what others fear. Become who others can't.